You are about to see the story of Noah's Ark. Well, not as some children's fable about a floating zoo, but as this incredibly chilling, brilliant blueprint for civilizational collapse
Right,
and
yeah.
collective labor. It's really the absolute minimum viable structure required to just restart human morality from scratch. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, today, for you listening, we are initiating a total system override. I mean, we are completely abandoning standard theological or, spiritual readings of these ancient texts.
Completely abandoning them, yeah.
Right, so if you're looking for a Sunday school lesson about, like, talking snakes or magical boats and a bearded man in the sky, you are definitely in the wrong place today.
Yeah, you might want to tune out now.
Exactly. Because instead, we are conducting a strict forensic sociological teardown of Genesis chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9.
And to do that, we are adopting a radically different posture today. We're utilizing a framework that we call the universal lens, or religion as applied physics.
Religion as applied physics. I love that term.
Right, because we have to operate under the strict assumption that the ancient writers were not, hallucinating magic.
Right, they weren't just making things up.
No, exactly. They were not primitive people making up campfire stories just because they were frightened by thunderstorms. They were actually documenting the brutal physical realities of human survival.
The friction of living together.
Yes, social friction, natural law. So every spiritual, miraculous, or divine word you read in this text is actually it's a linguistic vessel.
A container.
Right, a container holding a material, sociological, or psychological truth that they just didn't have the modern academic vocabulary to describe.
So instead of using terms like societal collapse
Yeah.
or systemic extraction or agricultural infrastructure, which obviously didn't exist yet, they encoded the structural realities of their world into the language of the divine.
Precisely. And that requires a very specific methodology for us today. Our first rule here is that we have to reverse engineer the vocabulary.
Okay, break that down for us. What did that look like?
Well, when we hit a spiritual concept, like a blessing, a curse, a miracle, we have to stop and ask, what physical friction or social crisis was this ancient community actually facing?
Right, like what was the literal problem on the ground?
Exactly. And what structural utility did that specific concept provide to keep them from literally tearing each other apart?
Okay, that makes sense. And then the second rule is mapping the dialectical trajectory, right?
Yes, because we are not analyzing these texts in a vacuum. For every structural mechanism we uncover in Genesis, we are going to trace a direct, continuous line forward to the New Testament.
So we're running a wire all the way through the canon.
We have to. We have to prove how the figure of Christ directly confronts, absorbs, or utilizes that exact same historical mechanism.
I see.
We are essentially tracking the evolution of an algorithm across thousands of years of human history.
Okay, let's put that methodology to the test immediately. Let's dive into the friction of total collapse in Genesis chapter 6.
Let's do it.
So most people know the broad strokes, right? Humanity multiplies, things get violent, God gets angry, and a flood is imminent.
Yeah.
But the text introduces these beings called the sons of God taking human women.
Right, the Nephilim.
Yeah, the Nephilim, which the text describes as the mighty ones of ancient times, men of name. And historically, I mean, a lot of readers get totally bogged down trying to figure out if these were fallen angels or like 12-foot-tall mythological monsters.
Which is completely missing the point.
Right, because if we reverse engineer the vocabulary, looking at the geopolitical realities of the ancient Near East, men of name sounds a lot less like folklore and a lot more like early Bronze Age warlords.
That is the exact translation of the material reality. I mean, anthropological records from early Mesopotamian state formation, roughly around the Uruk period, show this massive shift.
Shift from what to what?
Well, from egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands to highly stratified agrarian societies. So the Nephilim, these so-called men of name, they represent unchecked, concentrated power structures.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it's an early codified record of severe class struggle and the total breakdown of social cohesion. So the narrative of the sons of God taking whichever women they chose.
That's a systemic memory.
Exactly. It's a memory of elites hoarding resources, monopolizing reproduction, and extracting labor from the populace without any consequence. The moral algorithm of the society had completely failed.
He was crashing.
Yes. The elite tier was extracting so much from the base that the entire infrastructure was literally buckling.
See, that reframes the entire crisis. It's not just a generic complaint that people were being sinful in some, personal moralistic sense.
No, not at all.
It is a literal description of an unsustainable extraction economy. And crucially, the text says that God regrets making humanity. He is grieved to his heart and decides to wipe the board clean.
Which is fascinating.
Right, because attributing regret to an omniscient deity presents a massive philosophical
It
paradox.
really does.
I mean, it sounds like a software architect realizing halfway through deployment that the foundational code is corrupted and the app is going to crash.
That's a great way to put it.
So if we are treating this as applied physics, divine regret has to be a container for something deeply sociological.
And it is. It's a profound paradigm shift. Anyone familiar with ancient Near Eastern history knows the Hebrews weren't the only ones with a flood narrative.
Right, there's Gilgamesh.
The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, they both feature global floods. But in those Babylonian stories, do you know why the gods flood the earth?
Remind me.
It's because humans are multiplying and making too much noise.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, the gods are trying to sleep. It's essentially a divine noise complaint.
That's amazing.
But the Genesis account completely subverts that. The regret of God in Genesis 6 is early humanity's attempt to explain catastrophic civilizational failure, but through the lens of a moral architect.
Oh, I see. So the writers are looking at the rubble of a collapsed society and recognizing that the failure wasn't due to some capricious, annoyed god who just wanted to take a nap.
Exactly. The failure was structural. They realized that the design of a society built on unchecked violence, the Nephilim model, is fundamentally flawed and unsalvageable.
It has to be scrapped.
And that structural recognition leads directly to the ark. If the flood is the unavoidable deletion of corrupted societal code, the ark is the backup drive.
The backup drive, okay.
But we have to strip away the imagery of a magical teleportation device. The ark represents salvation through collective labor. The text states that Noah walks with God.
Which means what materialistically?
In a materialist reading, walking with God means his physical motion and his organization are aligned with the ultimate pattern of order. So while the Nephilim are out there extracting, hoarding, and consuming,
Noah is building.
Noah's building. The ark is a meticulously planned communal preparation for catastrophe. It's the creation of an isolated survival economy. He's organizing labor, gathering resources, and creating a sealed system of trust, while the world outside just tears itself apart through its own systemic contradictions.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to our first dialectical trajectory. We have this mechanism in Genesis 6, right? A corrupted society, unchecked elites, a system so broken that it necessitates complete erasure.
Yes.
And it's encoded as God's destructive regret. So if we were tracing this wire to the New Testament, we need to find the exact same mechanism, the divine confronting a failed, unsalvageable social structure. Where is it?
We find that exact collision in Luke chapter 19.
Okay, set the scene.
Jesus is approaching the city of Jerusalem, and he is looking at a city deeply corrupted by religious elites who have essentially turned the temple into an extraction economy.
Which completely mirrors the hoarding of the Nephilim.
Exactly. And the city is also buckling under impending Roman imperial violence. The social contradictions are at a breaking point, just like in Genesis 6. And what is his response?
He weeps over it.
He weeps. The distant regret in Genesis becomes embodied tears in Luke. We are witnessing the evolution of the mechanism.
That's incredible.
Right. In Genesis, the friction of a failed society is met with distant, destructive regret, resulting in the wiping out of the system through the flood. But dialectically, the algorithm has been upgraded.
Upgraded how?
When Christ confronts the identical sociological friction in Jerusalem, that distant regret has evolved into embodied sorrow. And because the mechanism has evolved, the resolution changes.
Oh, Jake, you're going.
The friction of a failed society is met not with a flood to erase humanity, but with a cross to absorb the violence. The trajectory moves from distant regret to embodied sorrow, leading ultimately to sacrifice rather than erasure.
So the system is still broken.
Yes, the system is still fundamentally broken, but the method for handling the breakdown has shifted from deletion to redemption.
That is a brilliant evolution of the concept. It takes the same sociological equation and solves it with, like, advanced moral mathematics.
It really does.
Okay, so the system fails, the warning sirens go off, and we hit the actual bottleneck. Let's move to Genesis chapter 7 and 8.
The airlock ceiling.
Exactly. Noah and his family enter the ark, and the text gives incredibly specific inventory instructions. They bring clean animals by sevens and unclean animals by twos.
Right.
Then the skies open, the deep bursts, and the floodwaters prevail for 150 days. It is a total wipeout of all terrestrial infrastructure.
It is the ultimate systemic rupture. You have to view the flood not just as a meteorological phenomenon, but as the physical manifestation of a society that could not sustain itself crashing down.
Yeah, and what always strikes me here is the specific math of the cargo. Why 7 pairs of some animals and only 2 pairs of others?
It's a survival calculation.
Right, because if we're reading this materially, this isn't random zoo curation.
Yeah.
This is a highly calculated post-apocalyptic supply chain. 2 of the unclean, 7 of the clean.
We have to look at the caloric and biological realities of the ancient Near East. Clean, in this historical context, materially translates to domestically viable, edible, and ritually acceptable for communal use.
Yeah.
While unclean refers to scavengers, predators, or animals simply not suited for sustainable farming or human consumption in that specific biome.
Right, like you don't farm vultures.
Exactly, you don't farm vultures. And consider the biological gestation periods. Sheep and goats, they take about 5 months to gestate.
Okay.
If you step off the ark, meaning if you emerge from the civilizational bottleneck with only 2 sheep, and you immediately need to eat one to survive a harsh winter, or a predator takes one, your genetic line is dead.
Because you've just eaten your breeding stock.
Precisely. The 7 pairs instruction is a raw survival calculation for an agrarian restart. The ancient writers are incurring the reality that to establish a functioning ecosystem, you need a massive surplus.
A surplus of clean animals.
Yes, to have enough animals for immediate food, and crucially, to facilitate the necessary sacrificial rituals.
Let's expand on those sacrificial rituals, actually, because I think modern readers tend to think of animal sacrifice as just some primitive religious appeasement, like throwing meat on a fire to make God happy.
Right, but materially, a communal sacrifice is an ancient social safety net.
It's a feast.
It is a feast. In a traumatized post-apocalyptic micro-society, slaughtering a valuable animal, cooking it, and distributing the protein equitably among the survivors, that is the ultimate mechanism for binding a fractured community together.
It rebuilds social trust.
It absolutely does. That is the exact utility of the ritual. The mathematics of the ark calculate the burn rate of their protein supply versus the gestation period of their livestock, all while factoring in the social necessity of communal feasting.
So it's incredibly pragmatic.
Very. The ark, therefore, represents the absolute minimum viable structure needed to carry a moral and genetic code through a historical bottleneck.
While everything outside the ark is entropy.
Everything outside is the consequence of unrestrained extraction. Inside the ark is managed surplus, collective labor, and preserved structure.
Okay, so how do we run the wire from this? From this physical, wooden, minimum viable structure to the New Testament? What is the dialectical trajectory of the ark itself?
So the ark serves as the aligned pattern of survival. It is a singular structure that preserves the future while the corrupt world is destroyed.
Okay.
Now, fast forward to the 1st century, the Jewish world was facing another massive deluge. Not of water, but of Roman imperialism.
Right, the legions.
The siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD was a catastrophic historical bottleneck. To survive this, the early Christian community needed a new ark. And the New Testament absorbs this structural mechanism by positioning Jesus himself as the reference implementation.
Oh, a reference implementation. That's a software architecture term, right?
It is, yeah.
It's the standard, fully functional model by which all other versions or adaptations are measured. It proves the code worked.
Precisely. So just as the ark was the physical vessel that carried humanity through the deluge, Christ becomes the living, non-contradictory behavioral vessel that carries the moral law through the destruction of the old religious and social order.
So they don't board a boat.
No, instead of boarding a physical boat, the early Christians were instructed to board the behavioral pattern of Christ.
Wow.
The mechanism shifts from a physical structure of wood and pitch to a behavioral structure of radical trust, shared provision, and nonviolence. The church, acting as a body of mutual aid, becomes the minimum viable structure to survive the imperial deluge of the 1st century.
That's a huge shift.
Both the wooden ark and the early church demand a radical new kind of collective survival in a world that is completely drowning.
So the geometry of survival completely evolves. It moves from engineering a boat to engineering a community.
Exactly.
And that leads us to the aftermath. The waters recede, the airlock opens, and we enter the mud. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 7 establishes the new baseline.
The reset button has been pushed.
But the world they are stepping back into is completely ruined. God gives Noah a new set of rules. Humans are told to multiply, but the relationship with nature is fractured.
Right, the text says the fear and dread of humans will be upon the animals.
Yeah, and the human diet officially expands to include meat, but with a strict taboo against eating flesh with the lifeblood still in it. And crucially, we get the first codified justice ethic in the Bible.
Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed.
Yes. This represents a massive structural shift away from the idealized harmony of the Garden of Eden. We are now dealing with pure, pragmatic survival mechanics.
We really are.
So put yourself in the mud of that new baseline for a second. You've just stepped off the ark. There are no institutions. There are no police. There are no courts.
To the vacuum.
If someone steals your surplus grain or murders a member of your family, what is your structural recourse? Genesis 9.6 essentially legally mandates revenge, blood for blood.
Right.
Now, to modern ears, this sounds incredibly brutal. We usually map moral progress as moving away from violence. How is a legal mandate for reciprocal violence considered a technological step forward for this society?
We have to look at this with absolute forensic coldness. This verse is not a divine ideal for an eternal utopia. It is a tribal survival instinct codified into law. Remember what caused the flood in the first place.
Unchecked asymmetrical violence.
Exactly. The strong, the Nephilim, taking from the weak without any consequence. In a fragile post-apocalyptic vacuum, you are existing in a Hobbesian state of nature. The only way to prevent a rapid return to the unchecked violence that just destroyed the world is the absolute ironclad guarantee of reciprocal violence.
That's a massive inversion of how this is typically taught.
Mhm.
You're taking an ethic that is almost universally criticized today as barbaric an eye for an eye and repositioning it as a necessary progressive technology for its era.
Because it was.
It's mutually assured destruction on a tribal level.
It is the invention of deterrence. Think about it. Without an institutional state to hold a monopoly on violence, it creates a mathematical equilibrium of terror.
A mathematical equilibrium of terror.
You know that if you strike, you will be struck back with exact parity. It bounds the violence. It prevents the escalation of blood feuds where, one murder leads to a generational massacre. The structure demands exactly one life for one life, capping the runaway potential of vengeance.
It's an algorithm designed to prevent systemic runaway.
Yes.
And the dietary restriction functions similarly, doesn't it? You can eat meat, but not with lifeblood in it. This isn't just an arbitrary culinary preference.
Not at all.
If you are now permitted to kill animals for survival, there is a profound psychological risk of descending into pure predatory savagery.
The blood taboo is a psychological mechanism designed for the domestication of the human mind. The taboo forces a ritualistic, mindful approach to taking life.
I can't just rip it apart.
You cannot just gorge on a fresh kill. You have to drain the blood. You have to pause, process the animal, and acknowledge the weight of taking a life. It physically separates human consumption from animalistic, instinctual savagery.
Wow, so it creates a buffer.
It creates a buffer of intentionality. It maintains human consciousness and moral weight even in the brutal act of killing for calories.
So we have this gritty, necessary baseline, right? Reciprocal violence to prevent total anarchy and mindful killing to prevent savagery. It's a very heavy, bloody scaffolding.
It is.
So how do we trace this dialectical trajectory? Where does Genesis 9.6 logically conclude in the New Testament?
This is actually one of the clearest, most dramatic dialectical wires in the entire biblical canon. We take the mechanism of Genesis 9.6 reciprocal violence as a structural deterrent, and we draw a continuous line directly to Matthew 5.38339.
The Sermon on the Mount.
The Sermon on the Mount. Jesus stands up and explicitly quotes this ancient survival mechanism. He says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth."
So he is isolating the exact structural scaffold of the Old Testament.
Exactly. He puts it right on the table.
Yeah.
And then he completely subverts it. He continues, "But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also."
It's a total system override.
It is.
But it's not just a nice pacifist sentiment, is it? I mean, in an honor and shame culture, which the ancient Middle East absolutely was, turning the other cheek is a profound sociological shock.
It is advanced game theory. The violent ethic of Genesis 9 was a necessary structural scaffold to keep the early tribe alive when the material conditions were desperate.
That history progressed.
History progressed, the social structure grew more complex, the scaffold did its job, but reciprocal violence ultimately traps humanity in an endless feedback loop. Christ provides a new, higher algorithm. By absorbing the blow without returning it, you break the cycle of violence entirely.
Because returning violence for violence just maintains the baseline of the system.
Mm.
Turning the cheek disrupts the system.
It introduces a totally new variable that the violent structure doesn't know how to compute. It forces the aggressor to recognize the humanity of the victim rather than just bracing for the retaliatory strike.
The mechanism evolved from survival through deterrence to redemption through non-retaliation.
Yes. Once the social structure could bear it, the ancient scaffolding was removed, and a new algorithm was deployed to dismantle the violence from the inside out.
That is a breathtaking progression. It really is.
Yeah.
But human development is never a straight upward line, is it? We don't just leap to perfection.
Far from it.
And that brings us to the final half of the chapter, where the idealism of the New Start crashes incredibly hard into economic reality. Genesis 9, verses 8 through 29.
The vineyard.
Yeah, God places a bow in the clouds as a sign of the covenant that water will never again destroy all flesh. Following this stabilization, Noah, who the text calls a man of the soil, plants a vineyard.
A man of the soil, yes.
He drinks the wine, gets blackout drunk, and passes out naked in his tent. His son, Ham, sees his father's nakedness and goes outside to tell his brothers, Shem and Japheth. The brothers walk backward with a garment to cover their father without looking.
Right.
When Noah wakes up and realizes what Ham did, he issues a devastating curse. But he doesn't curse Ham. He curses Ham's son, Canaan, saying, "A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers."
It is arguably one of the most consequential and historically weaponized narratives in the entire text.
I mean, think about the timeline here. Humanity just survived the literal apocalypse. They receive a beautiful, glowing guarantee of cosmic stability. And what is the very first thing they do with this fresh start?
They fall apart.
They get drunk, they commit a family betrayal, and they invent systemic subjugation. It took exactly 0 generations to revert to class struggle.
0 generations.
Well, let's start with the environmental guarantee. How do we read a rainbow materialistically?
Well, we have to look at what the rainbow represents cognitively for an early human civilization. It is the psychological and structural stabilization of the natural order.
Meaning what for their daily lives?
If you believe the world might randomly end in a catastrophic flood tomorrow, if the weather is a chaotic, wrathful entity, you do not plant a vineyard. Agriculture requires a massive investment of labor with a significantly delayed return.
Right.
You expend precious calories digging, planting, and tending, hoping that years later you will harvest a crop.
So the rainbow isn't just a promise not to drown everyone. It's the cognitive baseline required for agriculture. You only invest in a delayed return economy if you trust the cyclical stability of the seasons.
Exactly. The bow in the clouds is the narrative container for the stabilization of the climate. It is the structural guarantee that makes agriculture possible. But the dialectical contradiction is immediate.
Because the moment Noah trusts the climate, he becomes a man of the soil.
He plants a vineyard. This marks the dawn of agrarian property. A vineyard produces grapes, which are fermented into wine, a highly storable, valuable surplus calorie. But with property in surplus comes vulnerability.
Yeah, Noah creates surplus, consumes it recklessly, and completely loses his defenses. Hence the drunkenness and the nakedness.
And that vulnerability invites exploitation. The incident in the tent, Ham seeing his father's nakedness, is widely debated in theological circles.
Right, what did it actually mean?
Some argue it implies a deeper physical violation, while others see it as an act of profound disrespect. But materially, it represents a political breach.
A political breach.
It is a younger generation attempting to exploit the vulnerability of the patriarch to seize authority over the newly established agrarian property. It is an attempted coup.
Which leads to the curse of Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be. Now, we have to handle this carefully because historically, this specific verse has been used to justify the worst atrocities in human history.
Yes, including the transatlantic slave trade and race-based chattel slavery.
Right. So if we were performing a forensic teardown, how does the materialist lens deconstruct this curse?
The materialist lens strips away the magic and reveals the grim historical reality. This is not a magical hex uttered by a grumpy patriarch that somehow permanently rewrites the DNA of an entire lineage.
Yeah.
It is the historical record of how early agrarian societies rapidly divided into classes. When you transition to agriculture, you require immense back-breaking labor. Someone has to dig the irrigation ditches. Someone has to carry the heavy loads.
You need a workforce.
Early state formations relied on corvée labor, forced labor extracted from the lower classes or conquered peoples. The curse of Canaan functions as the ideological justification for the creation of that permanent underclass.
Wow. It is the invention of the concept of masters and servants. It encodes the material reality that in an economy based on surplus and property, the society will inevitably fracture.
Exactly.
The people who own the vineyard need people to work the vineyard. The curse is the biblical text preserving the memory of the exact moment human equality collapsed back into systemic exploitation.
It is the ideological founding of a servant class. They barely stepped off the boat, and they are already dividing the human family into those who own the means of production and those who will be forced to labor under it.
So how do we trace this? Where does the wire lead from the curse of Canaan? How does the New Testament confront the ideological framework that justifies subjugating your brother?
We draw a line directly from the curse of Canaan to the New Testament's revolutionary response in Luke 1.4655.
Commonly known as Mary's Song, or the Magnificat.
Ex-
So a young, pregnant, working-class woman living under military occupation sings a song that announces the ultimate reversal of Genesis 9.
She sings, "He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty."
It is a direct countercurse.
It is the systemic inversion of the agrarian class structure established after the flood. Furthermore, the trajectory connects directly to Christ's actions. Think about how Jesus operates within this social hierarchy.
Okay.
He doesn't just preach a message to the servants of servants. He actively identifies as one.
He washes his disciples' feet. I mean, in the ancient world, that was strictly the job of a slave.
Yeah.
He physically takes on the role of Canaan.
By identifying with the lowest class, Christ completely overturns the hierarchy of Genesis 9. He absorbs the mechanism of the curse by willingly taking the position of the subjugated. He proves that the kingdom he is building operates on shared provision and mutual service, rather than systemic extraction and generational curses. The structural subjugation invented by Noah's family in the vineyard is systematically dismantled by the radical solidarity of Christ.
It's like watching a thousands of years long game of chess. The opening moves in Genesis create the board, the property, the violence, the necessary deterrence, the class division, and the endgame in the Gospels flips the board completely over.
That's a great analogy.
You truly cannot understand the radical, disruptive nature of the New Testament without understanding the heavy, brutal material structures of the Old Testament that it was designed to overcome.
It is the dialectic in motion. The text is a continuous record of our agonizing moral evolution.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this entire exploration. We started today by abandoning the pastel-colored nursery versions of these stories.
The Sunday school versions?
Right. We took these ancient chapters and revealed them through the materialist lens as a gritty, highly sophisticated manual for surviving civilizational collapse. We saw God's regret as the structural recognition of a doomed extractive society.
Yes.
We saw the Ark as the technology of collective labor and the absolute minimum viable structure to carry a moral code through a historical bottleneck.
We unpacked the harsh tribal justice of blood for blood as a mathematically necessary scaffold to prevent anarchy.
And we witnessed the tragic, immediate return of human exploitation, the moment property and surplus re-entered the picture with the vineyard and the curse.
And critically, we traced every single one of those material mechanisms forward. We watched the algorithm evolve from the friction of the flood to the survival of the pattern to the ultimate transcendence of those violent and exploitative mechanisms by Christ.
From wiping out enemies to weeping over them.
From reciprocal violence to turning the cheek.
From cursing the servant to becoming the servant. It changes everything about how you read this book. It makes it alive, not as a collection of magical spells, but as human history agonizing its way toward a functional morality.
It really does.
So I want to leave you with one final unresolved thought to explore on your own. We've talked extensively about the Ark as a technological and social vessel required to survive the very first recorded collapse of a violent, unsustainable system.
Right.
It was a physical boat holding a specific pattern of life, dictated by the material conditions of the ancient Near East.
The conditions of that specific era required a wooden structure to preserve the genetic and moral baseline.
But look at the friction points of our world today. We are existing in an era of accelerating global friction. We have massive ecological crises, extreme wealth inequality, systemic extraction, and geopolitical instabilities that feel incredibly, terrifyingly familiar to the conditions described in Genesis 6.
The Nephilim are back, essentially.
Warning sirens are sounding again. So the provocative question is this: what does an ark look like today?
It is the most vital question we can ask when applying the sociological engine block to the present day. Are we trying to build a literal physical boat? Are we relying on billionaires building fortified bunkers in New Zealand or like attempting to establish off-world colonies on Mars? Or is the next arc something entirely different?
I would argue it has to be different.
Is it a new moral algorithm, a decentralized way of structuring human trust, mutual aid, and collective labor that can actually survive the deluge of the 21st century? Because if the history we studied today holds true, the arc of the future won't be made of wood and pitch.
No.
It will be made of organized behavior, shared provision, and unbreakable solidarity.
The diagnostic landscape of human survival has always been murky. It is covered in floodwaters, blood, and vineyard soil. But the structure is there. You just need the right lens to see the bones beneath the mud.
Thank you for joining us for this intense exploration. The sources hold endless depths for those willing to look past the surface and reverse engineer the realities beneath. Keep questioning the structure, keep looking for the mechanism, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.